I'd like to use this presentation to focus on spirituality for democracy. This topic invites us to identify and critique the spiritual resources that are needed for democratic participation in the 21st century here in Jamaica and the wider world. Modern expressions of democracy are in crisis. You name the country, it is happening. Every national context is teetering with challenges and conflicts because governments and their citizens are worried concerning how much influence they should allow through participation that can shape the decision-making process of governance. This topic is of extreme importance for the Jamaican context because there is malaise. Malaise has crept into our contemporary forms of governance. The high levels of corruption that we're hearing about every day, violence, the murder rate, one of the highest, not only here in the Caribbean, but the wider world. All of this suggests that we're fast becoming a failed state. And no matter how much wrong is committed by the powerful elite, no one seems to be held accountable. According to Michael Brown, the pattern of covering up abuses of power is an ever-growing threat to the Jamaican democracy. Or should we use Damian Marley in his 2005 powerful song, Welcome to Jam Rock, I quote, "To win election, them trick we, then them do nothing at all," unquote. So all of this is really saying democracy is experiencing a deep crisis. The word democracy conjures images of free and fair election in which people vote to determine models of governance of different institutions and the leaders who will be elected to manage the process. But it's much more than that. It's not just to do with national government. It works from the family, the community, the institution, right up into the national state. Democracy at its best requires that people are fully involved in the process through their representatives that they elect and through the laws too that are formed. Although democracy is promoted as a phenomenon that is linked to Western society, it is much more than that. Democracy has evolved. The political journey of democracy from the fall of communism to our contemporary Western style democracy. Sadly, it has been accompanied by painful upheavals, characterized at times by uncontrollable get-rich schemes operated by powerful elites. Sometimes it seems that democracy brings out the worst in human beings, features which other forms of governance would put under control in other places. They are celebrated. Underlying any democratic practices of good governance is the right of every citizen to uphold, to have access to an independent judicial system that is free from party or government interference, so that they may seek justice. I underline, seeking justice for what is perceived to be a gross wrong that has been done. But even so, the quest for justice has reached such a high price that only the rich at times can achieve that objective. This practice, which is usually protected by the Constitution, is informed by a spirituality that is rooted in fairness. Justice requires fairness that keeps in check the human capacity to act fairly and not out of self-interest, but rather out of the common good of all. So good governance calls for holding accountable the performance of all. It is performance management of those who exercise power over others. Yet, I must say, brothers and sisters, that democratic forms of governance are not set in stone. Rather, they are formed as a result of our human deliberation and praxis and cultural development, and therefore we must remain open for further reformation. In other words, democracy must constantly be reformed. It is this intrinsic capacity for renewal that opens democracy to converse with spirituality. Contemporary expressions of democracy, especially in our Western context, they are accompanied by lack of confidence and consensus. I must say, sometimes filled with insecurity. There is deep lack of concern and an unwillingness to tackle anything with passion and with commitment. Therefore, after so many years of independence, some of the things that our people experienced in the 60s, they're still with us. We don't have the capacity, the willpower to make a difference. I ask myself at times, why is it that we have not built another dam that can hold water after so many years when the population has moved from just 1-point-something million to close to 3 million? What is going wrong with our democratic models of governance? There is a lack of consistent focus on resolving problems that affect the well-being of ordinary citizens. And in spite of the commendable achievements that we have accomplished, and yes, we have accomplished a lot, the ways in which at the beginning of 62, the educational capacity of our people was very low. We have accomplished a lot over these years, but yet, my God, we still have so much more to accomplish that we have left untouched. The perennial national crisis suggests that our democratic model is constantly or consistently falling short of its vision and objectives. Social change has resulted in pluralistic and other types of diversities that sometimes breed conflict, and many persons are no longer willing to give their allegiance to the center. As Adebe would put it in the seminal text, these things fall apart and the center cannot hold. Contemporary democracy functions therefore like a bubble. It is very delicate. It is in a very delicate state of existence, and it can easily burst, almost like you have a needle that can juke the balloon, as it were. So it is there 1 minute, alive and well, and one piece of action results in a crisis and the content being spilled. You're unable to put the content back into the container. The trust that democracy demands is used by many governments around the world to violate liberties, people's freedom. They use artificial intelligence without being authorized by the people. They read the emails, they encroach into your privacy, they listen to your telephone calls, and then they claim They have done it in the name of protecting national security. I dare say, sisters and brothers, the price of democracy is eternal vigilance. This presentation, therefore, argues that an overhaul of the democratic project is urgently needed in order to facilitate full and meaningful participation of citizens for the benefit of the common good. And this necessitates a concerted effort by community-based groups. We must encourage community-based groups holding discussion together, discussing the issues. The issues of our nation must not be left for Parliament. They must be discussed in our schools, in our churches, in our community groups, in our youth group. We must all participate and expose and neutralize all the false constructs of democracy that create violence within our nation. It is somewhat contradictory to speak about Christian spirituality and democracy, sadly, because I'm a part of the church. I'm proud to be a follower of Jesus Christ, but I must admit that the church, throughout its history, especially in the history leading up to the modern period, the church has not embraced democratic models of governance. Indeed, the church has been much more comfortable with autocratic, monarchical, dictatorial forms of governance. Sometimes our leaders, the bishops or priests or pastors, whatever name we use to call our clergy, they function more like monarchs. They speak and they act as if they are the only voice. And so modern expressions of democracy of Christianity, I must say, has uncritically entered into a strategic partnership with non-life-giving democratic values and structures. That is why the Christian religion needs renewal to re-examine its relationship with democracy. That's why I speak about spirituality for democracy. It calls for renewal. The lifestyle that we are called to live by Jesus must demonstrate the sacredness or the holiness of life, the devoutness that are glued to supporting the full humanization of God's people. So if Christian spirituality is to inform democracy, it must bequeath fidelity to practice of high moral standards in its political ethic, and not just political, in its political and economic ethic. And this kind of allegiance to a transcendent being whom we call God, that holds all creation accountable for its stewardship, and it calls for a commitment to learning by doing. Traditionally, Christian participation in politics of a nation was based on the model that Paul outlines in Romans 13, that which declares all elected governments are divinely approved and should therefore be unconditionally obeyed because the authorities that exist are appointed by God. I pause. This kind of spirituality was built then on an uncritical alliance with the political paternalism of that day. The citizens were duped into surrendering critical judgment concerning decisions that were being made on their behalf. They were told to, quote unquote, obey their leaders because I speak in this contemporary era that we must express critical solidarity, but also we must keep critical distance. That's what should be normative. Alan Bosa, the great South African theologian, suggests critical solidarity, but critical distance. Contemporary expressions and experience of democracy are being called into question by people, and the inadequacy of the democratic process in meeting the felt needs of people, this has resulted in distrust of leaders in the institutions of governance, in judiciary, in education, sadly, in the church, and all these key stakeholders who are important leaders in the democratic process are being called to account. A democratic society, therefore, requires that we all must pay attention and focus on the spiritual values, also to ensure that we focus in making sure that the economic beast that run the nation and provide the wealth of the nation, that it does not thrive on unrestrained self-interest, and that it is done so at the expense of the common good of the community. One can therefore argue that we need to hold into account our capitalist neoliberal order, the free enterprise, which at times they have hijacked our democracy, the ways in which politicians are bought, the laws in our nations are fixed to suit the dominance of the economic order, and not really for the well-being of the people. The contemporary expressions of democracy is embedded in the construct of our market economy. That's why I want to bring Marcus Garvey, the Pan-Africanist, the Jamaican philosopher whose opinion speaks to our contemporary situation. He says, you must never sell yourself to a politician. Always make your vote count for bringing about reforms you and others think are right for your community. Never exchange it for money. And in countries where, as a race, you are allowed to vote, always work to get the vote by way of reform. Use the help of everybody, but have political power to bring about changes that will give you the right to vote. Otherwise, you will be governed without your consent. To vote is a spiritual right. To vote is to make an attempt to share in the governance of the nation and of the community. I dare say, my brothers and sisters, that I was deeply saddened by the last election when the data points to only, was it 37% of our electorate voting? What happened to the 63%? The majority, almost 2/3 of our nation, opted out. And then we are complaining. Complaining about what? The complaint is rooted right in front of our faces. Participation in politics has come to mean much more than voting in a national election, however. I want to go back to Damian Marley and his critique of the Jamaican democracy in the post-independent era. Back to that song I used at the beginning. Welcome to Jam Rock. I quote, welcome to Jam Rock. Poor people are dead at random. Political violence can't done. Pure ghosts and phantom. The youth them get blind by stardom. Now the King of Kings call old man to picnic. So wave your hand, and if you're with me, to see this separation sick me. them suit no fit me to win election, them trick we, then them do nothing at all. That's what is called social critique, or one could say prophetic critique. Marley serves as signpost of the capacity of the democratic system to become corrupted by unscrupulous, power-hungry actors. He asserts, in a context of economic survival of the poor within Jamaica, that the practice of democracy serves the corrupt players in the system. His conclusion is that the system does not fit. It does not function in the interest of the poor who are killed at random in political violence. The suffering of the poor, he argues, is immeasurable. And then in the name of democracy, the power-hungry calls election, which in practice is a trick to deceive the poor, because in the end, they will not do anything to save the plight of the poor. Therefore, processing the tools to expose the mask that these deceptive leaders use in the management of the democratic process is an important spiritual resource that every follower of Jesus Christ must take on board. Neutrality is not an option in the democratic process. Democracy that is meant to foster good constitution and laws that facilitates good governance, political stability, economic and social development, and protecting the common good can be hijacked by powerful economic forces that bribe our leaders who are susceptible because they lack strong political ethic. Therefore, good governance is a prerequisite for peace. We want peace in Jamaica. Focus on good governance, protection of human rights, protecting our children, our women, our young people, our elderly, protecting the human rights and the social progress. That's what produces just economic growth. If we want economic growth, protect the rights of the poor. I need to conclude. What am I saying? If spirituality for democracy is to work in partnership with political and economic democracy for development, it requires an environment that creates a safe space for every person. Safe for every person to express his or her political perspective on any issue that affects their well-being and that of their community. And in this era of information overload, the social media babies that are being born today, where citizens must therefore become proactive in holding our democratic system, because it, and not just the system, holding our elected leaders accountable in all the different institutions. There is need to entertain a healthy suspicion of all forms of governance. Because, and for us Christians and our Christian faith, we should understand that we must have this uncritical partnership with democracy, what Alan Bosak, the great South African, argued for, that we must have critical solidarity, but also maintain critical distance. Because this will hold the majority rule, whatever we call majority rule, we need to hold them accountable if from totalitarian models of governance. Let me therefore leave with us some spiritual resources for democratic participation. Firstly, openness to the exchange of ideas and learning from one another, from those who are different from us. This democracy is not rooted in birds of a feather. I need you, you need me. We are not all the same, but we need to, Jamaica we practice a type of tribalist political discourse. For God's sake, it's time for us to grow up and move away from this tribalist model. Learn to relearn from the other. Openness to the exchange of ideas and learning. We must engage in mutual respect and affirmation. Secondly, the affirmation of the immeasurable worth of the other. Mutual respect. It's another way of saying, I see divinity in the humanity of each person. None of us created the other. God created the other. That's why we say in our Jamaican social discourse, respect. It's at the core. It's indispensable to foster and build democratic values. Thirdly, the discussion and contribution of others in local communities. We must take the discussions of the local to inform the national. Although, sadly, how many years of independence in 62, and we are still singing God Save the Queen. I ask myself, how long, oh Lord? Forever? When will we mature as a nation and have confidence in our ability? Not just how we elect people at the top, but there are people in our local community. We must listen to the proverbs, to the songs. We must listen to the discourse of our people, the elders, the youth, the women in local community. What is it that they're saying? How do they see the fullness of life that God calls them to live? Fourthly, people must be given space to form their own life-giving structures and to be able to replicate those at local levels to meet their needs. Not every order has to come from on top. We must be able to know what is good. God has placed God's Spirit in our hearts. We must know the good thing. We must do the right thing. Next, another important resource is what is needed. What is needed is an inclusive spirituality that empowers us for free participation in election. Inclusive spirituality. In other words, just like in the way we have many different churches, many people, one God. In the same way, we can have an inclusive spirituality. Some pray kneeling down, some pray standing up, some pray with hands stretched out, some pray with hands like this. All different types of liturgical practices, but one God. Inclusive spirituality in the way in which we are empowered and made free to participate. I want to also highlight next that we must hold fast to the limits in term appointment. Term appointment, limit to office holding. We must encourage this. We have too many of our leaders who think that they must die in office. We must learn to let go, encourage our young, let them learn. We must mentor people, mentor our young to take over so that they learn also how to protect the elderly. How they must learn also that leadership must constantly be renewed. It doesn't always mean that as you grow old, you end up with more wisdom. Maybe you can grow old and you never mature. You're at the same place. Limit in term office, in office holding. And this applies to the church too. I speak as one who is in the priesthood, in the ministry. As a minister, we must learn when to move on. and to let others come and participate. Next, I want to lift up the resource of team leadership with separate authorities. And so it is in Jamaica today. We must work hard to make sure our judiciary remain independent, not open to the influence of party political innuendos. They have their checks and balances that are needed. Keep our parliament focused, high integrity. We must put leaders there who are not, I must say, let me put it in another way. We must have leaders in parliament who are accountable to the people. They must be open books, and where they are found wanting, we must have laws that remove them before the term is up. The spirituality that undergirds democratic governance is rooted in servanthood. Servanthood. We don't own service. We are entrusted with the responsibility to serve, and we serve with humility, down-to-earth style, with the goal of empowering the people to help them to thrive, to help them to be deeply human. Finally, effective democratic governance requires the indispensable spiritual resource of accountability. Accountability. With responsibility comes accountability. Never surrender that. This is a key reason for democracy, holding one another accountable. Leaders are called upon to give an account of their stewardship, and to motivate why we should trust them again and again to serve and to represent the people. I pray that for this 2021 independent Jamaica, we renew ourselves to these spiritual resources where we hold all of us accountable. So at the end, those who follow will say, well done, good and faithful servant. Thank you.